This conference will now be recorded.
Everybody see the picture okay?
Yes.
Okay. Tonight I'm going to go over something that kind of sounds like a big picture, and I hope it all makes sense to you because it was interesting to put it all together. The title is The Wars of the World, and it's about the 20th century of wars that have engulfed our whole world, really. It's a bigger picture. I'm going to go over some of the wars, but not in very much detail. And then at the end, I'll try to put it all together. I start with a book that was written by a man named Niall Ferguson, who is a historian that I happen to enjoy very much. He's an Englishman, and the variation on H.G. Wells' book, The War of the World, was his original intention, but I haven't read The War of the World by H.G. Wells, so I don't know how much of a variation it is. Ferguson is a historian who is into revisioning views of history. He has rehabilitated imperialism and colonialism, for one thing. As opposed to calling them an awful thing, he saw them as a benefit to those who were imperialized. The book itself is a comprehensive analysis of all of the fighting that's gone on during the 20th century. It ends with the Korean conflict as far as the book is concerned, but then I decided to take it on through the rest of the 20th century. It outlines a combination of economic volatility, decaying empires, and psychopathic dictators, of which we've had quite a few in the last 100+ years. These factors produced the wars that ensued and those that followed the end of the book. Now, in order to understand the big picture, you got to know where we were in 1900. First, there was a Russian Empire. It was the Empire of the Tsars. Next, there was an Ottoman Empire. That was the empire located primarily in Constantinople that included much of what we call the Middle East, some of North Africa, and some of what is Western Asia. Then there was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, primarily Austria and Hungary, but also including what now is called, or at least part of what was called Yugoslavia. Then there was the German Empire. The German Empire primarily was in Africa. There was the Dutch Empire, which was primarily in Asia. That's not all of the empires. Then there was a Portuguese Empire in Asia and Africa. There was the French Empire. Much of the French Empire was either in Africa or in Asia. And of course, there was the British Empire, which was all over the world. Beyond that, there was the Empire of Japan. And the Empire of Japan had a lot to do with what followed for about the next 75 years. And then last and perhaps least, there was the Italian Empire. And what had happened to the world prior to 1900 is that these 10 groups of people had colonialized and imperialized the better part of the world and were controlling what was going on in the world. They established a type of order. Most of the order was done with military might, but basically these 10 empires control the world. Almost immediately, trouble started. First of all, there was the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, which was between the Russian Empire and Japan. And what happened was they had ambitions. They, the Japanese, had ambitions in Korea, and the Russians had ambitions in Manchuria, and they fought about it. They saw at that time, they being Russia, saw Japan as a lightweight. However, Russia suffered a number of defeats in this war. And the Tsar was convinced that Russia was going to win, and so he stayed involved in the war and lost. The victory of the Japanese military in this particular war transformed the balance of power in Eastern Asia. That's where Japan emerged as a great power. The next war that I want to talk about was the Mexican Civil War, and most of us don't know anything at all about it. It happened between 1910 and 1920. It was a major revolution. Up until that time, Mexico would have been considered a fairly insignificant part of Central America. But this war transformed Mexican culture and government. The two most famous revolutionaries were Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Those were names that I happen to be familiar with. If you will remember, Blackjack Pershing led an expedition into Mexico in the middle of that era, going after Villa. He did not capture Villa. Now, what I thought was interesting about it was how many people died in that revolution. Almost 2.5 million people died in Mexico in that revolution. And in fact, you might not remember this, but there was something called the Zimmerman telegram that was sent from the Germans to the Mexicans, trying to get the Mexicans to revolt against the United States. So by then, Mexico was actually considered a player. The Mexican Civil War was a harbinger of what was to come. The next war happened almost immediately. It was called the Balkan War. 4 Balkan states defeated the Ottoman Empire in the First Balkan War. In the Second Balkan War, the country of Bulgaria fought against all of the original combatants of the First War. That was, for all of those who were watching, a simple picture of how bad off the Ottoman Empire was, and it was a prelude to the First World War. The conflicts then expanded globally. World War I, known as the Great War, or the war to end all wars. I did not realize this until I was doing the research. 70 million military personnel were mobilized for the First World War. 60 million of them were Europeans, making it one of the 2 largest wars in history. And in fact, as I did some research, there were no more people mobilized in the Second War than there were in the first one.
Got a silly question, George.
Sure.
What did they call World War I instead of World War I? I mean, they didn't know there was going to be a 2.
They called it the Great War.
Just the Great War. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
The Allied forces were actually composed of 15 different countries. The main ones were France, Russia, and Great Britain. But at that time, Italy was on the side of the Allies, so was China, and so was Japan. There were only 4 central powers: Germany, Austria-Hungary, eventually the Ottoman Empire, and I forgot what the 4th one was. The war included 9 million combatant deaths and 13 million civilian deaths. It was a huge, huge impact on what was going on in the world at that time. Then what happened were a number of different genocides and the Spanish flu. Another 50 million people died almost as an immediate consequence to the First World War. The armistice that ended the war in 1918 solved very few problems, but laid the foundation for the next major war. That's about all that was accomplished by the First World War. That and making the Germans so angry that it justified the coming of Adolf Hitler. And then it got worse. The Russian Civil War, which took place during the First World War, initially what they did was they formed a democratic government and made the Tsar abdicate, and that government decided to continue the First World War. The communists then overthrew that elected government in Russia. What followed was a civil war between the Red Army and the White Army. And the White Army was not actually a coherent army. There were several different factions in the White Army, everything from the original czarists to other countries that decided they wanted to participate in it. It lasted 5 years and 13.5 million people died in the Russian Civil War. The communists eventually prevailed, and what they did was form the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not the USSR. That is a different organization, and I'll talk about it later. The next war was the Spanish Civil War. A group of army generals led by Franco led a revolt against the Republican government. Both the Nazis and several other countries decided to get involved in the war, supporting one side or the other. In fact, the Nazis supported Franco, and if I'm not mistaken, the Russians supported the Royalists. Franco prevailed, and what he did was establish a dictatorship. That dictatorship lasted, I believe, about 25 years until he died. 500,000 people died in the Spanish Civil War. Yeah. The next war was something called the Sino-Japanese War. And what happened was after the Japanese defeated the Russians, took over Korea, they decided they wanted part of China. Initially, they were not, Chiang Kai-shek was leading China at the time. Initially, the Chinese just retreated. But then war broke out when they decided to resist the further expansion of the Japanese forces. China then fought Japan for the period that's shown above. China was getting aid from both the Soviet Union and the United States. And we've talked quite a bit about the American involvement in China, but the Soviet Union was also supporting them.
Your slide didn't advance.
It didn't? Did it now?
No.
Nope.
Really? Because it isn't mine.
Showing the Spanish Civil War.
Well, what do I need to do?
You're frozen. It's
Let me try this. Are you seeing the new slide, Val?
no.
No.
Well, hell, now what do I do?
This conference will now be recorded.
It just
Yes,
came up.
go
The
ahead.
Sino-Japanese War just came up.
Okay, the Sino-Japanese War lasted 8 years. It really started when China being Chiang Kai-shek, chose to resist the Japanese forces that were already in China. They fought Japan with aid from both the Soviet Union and the United States. I don't know that we ever worked together, but 15, 20 million people died in the Sino-Japanese War.
George,
Excuse me?
George, you were talking about the Sino-Japanese War. What about the Boxer Rebellion with China and Japan? Did that?
that was Japan wasn't involved in that, I don't think, but it was way early.
1905, I think.
Right. I did not begin to cover all of the fighting that went on in the world. I picked
Okay.
You're
what
correct,
led up to
George.
the Second World
Japan
War.
was not involved with the Boxer Rebellion.
No,
Those were the Boxers and the U.S. troops.
right, among others. There were also Chinese troops involved, I guess. Leading up to the Second World War, first was the Great Depression, and I think you've heard me say this before. The Depression did not end until the Second World War started. It got better and then it got worse, but it was a factor in the war. Germans decided to rearm. Italians, in 1935, Adolf Hitler had a pact, and the Italians decided to invade Ethiopia, 35-36. What happened was, subsequent to that, the Brits went down to support the Ethiopians, and they were fighting the Italians. At the same time, Hitler decided to remilitarize the Rhineland. That was an area in Western Germany that was supposed to be military free. Hitler reoccupied it in 1936. In 1938, Hitler marched into Austria. He took over Austria in a bloodless, they decided to give in kind of coup. In 1938, the Germans occupied something called the Sudetenland, and the Sudetenland is an area in what was Czechoslovakia. You can see it on the map on the right. Hitler annexed it under the pretense that the people who lived in the Sudetenland were Germans, German heritage, and that they were being treated badly by the Czechoslovaks. That's when the Munich Accord was reached. Hitler said that was all that he wanted, and that if the French and the British acceded to him being in the Sudetenland, he would make no more demands. That was the conference in Munich in October of 38. The next thing that happened was he occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Because by occupying the Sudetenland, what he really did was he took over all of the Czechoslovak defense positions. Nobody did anything about that either. In September of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Now, where were those old empires that I talked about in 1900? Where were they by 1940? The Russian Empire of the Tsars had been destroyed. It had been replaced with the Soviet Empire of Stalin, filled with his purges and self-destruction. The Ottoman Empire had been fragmented into new nations. It became the Republic of Turkey and fragmented into the Arabic states from Saudi Arabia to Jordan to Syria and Lebanon. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was also fragmented into more new nations, eventually becoming Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Second Polish Republic. The German Empire had been completely dismembered by the Treaty of Versailles. All of its overseas territories had been ceded, and actually peripheral parts of the German homeland had been parceled out among the victorious Allies. So those empires, which had maintained order in the world in 1900, were gone. However, there were a few other empires left. Well, this one wasn't left. The Spanish Empire had been eliminated in the Spanish Civil War. Now Spain was a dictatorship. The Portuguese Empire had been reduced to a few territories along the coast of Africa and some bases in Asia. They were not powerful. However, the French Empire in 1940 was still substantial. It was focused in Indochina and Africa primarily. The British Empire continued to hold sway over a fourth of the world's population. However, as a power, by 1940, they were in economic decline, and worst of all, the jewel in the crown was ready to revolt. On the other hand, the Empire of Japan was at the pinnacle of its power. It had wrested Manchuria from the Russians, and it had conquered a sizable portion of China. So that's where those empires were in 1940. Hence, a power vacuum existed. Who walked into it? Adolf Hitler. World War II started in 1939. It lasted 6 years. It began with the invasion of Poland. Interestingly, Poland was invaded by the Germans from the south and the west, and invaded by the Russians from the north and the east. Poor Poland fell very quickly. The U.S. had been trying to constrain, and there's a lot of talk about how this constraint caused Pearl Harbor to happen. The United States made extremely restrictive demands on the expansion of Japan. They had an embargo on oil. They had an embargo on steel. We put the Japanese almost into a no-win situation. They chose to attack us at Pearl Harbor. The Second World War was fought in Africa. It was fought in Europe. It was fought in Asia. It was even fought in South America. It was truly a global war. However, most of the fighting actually took place in Russia. The parts that took place in Europe were fairly brief compared to what happened in Russia. The rest of it happened in the South Pacific. Most of the countries in the whole world, if you look at a list of who was involved, the only two countries that weren't involved in Europe were Sweden and Switzerland. And to my going through the data, I could not find any South American countries that got involved. Everybody else was involved. I don't think Central America was involved either. 75 million people died in the Second World War. 2/3 of those people were civilians. 400,000 Americans died in the war. The whole world was completely destabilized. And as I said earlier, there actually were not much difference in the number of people who were involved in the First World War and the Second World War. There were about 75 million people involved in the Second World War also. Now, what happened to the empires following World War II? The first thing that happened was the USSR was formed. What it was included in the USSR was the old Russian Empire, but they added these countries: Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, Romania, and Hungary. They did not do that with a lot of cooperation from the rest of the Allies. They did that because there were Russian troops in those countries, and nobody wanted to contest the fact that they shouldn't be there. The Republic of Yugoslavia was established in 1946. And if you remember the report that I had a couple of weeks ago, 30 to 40 years later, it balkanized and broke into about 6 different countries. Also from the Ottoman Empire came the Arabic states of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Palestine, and Lebanon. These all were formed after the Second World War as independent countries. In 1948, Israel, and we talked about this earlier, declared independence. It had been part of the Palestinian protectorate. 5 Arab countries attacked Israel, launching the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And if I'm not mistaken, it was followed by at least 3 more wars between the Arabs and the Israelis. Germany was divided in half. The Eastern German Republic came under the influence of the USSR, who stayed there until the wall fell down. 1989, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
At the end of the Second World War, the British Empire was still a fourth of the world, but it was teetering, and it would soon diminish quickly. India left the British Empire in 1947, and almost immediately a war between the Indians and the Pakistanis, and that was a religious war, happened in 1947. The Indians were Hindus, the Pakistanis were Muslims. And if you want to read a tragic story, read about the partition of India. The French Empire was briefly reinstated in its colonies in Indochina. We've talked about that in the past. Japan, soundly defeated, adopted a pacifistic constitution, became a democracy, and Japan, I believe, in their constitution has a statement that they will never fight a war again and has very few military assets. So that's what happened to those empires after the Second World War. So what happens? The focus shifts to Southeast Asia. First, to something called the Chinese Civil War. Not a subject that there was a great deal of information about in this country. It was between the government of the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist Party. Actually, it had started in 1927, but they put hostilities on hold between 37 and 45 because they wanted help from the Allies, and that, I guess, was one of the things that the Allies said, unless the two of you work together, we're not going to come in and help you. It resumed with the defeat of the Japanese, and basically Chiang Kai-shek was a paper tiger. The communists gained the upper hand, known generally as the Chinese Communist Revolution. 7 million people died in that struggle. Next was the Korean War. That was between North Korea, with the support of China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea, who had the support of the United Nations, but principally had the support of the United States. It began actually with insurrections in the South. The Communist North had sent insurrectionists into the South trying to foment a rebellion. That didn't work. In June of 1950, the North Koreans invaded the South Korean area. It ended in unofficially, and I say unofficially because it never actually formally came to an end, on 27 July 1953 in an armistice. 4 million people died in the Korean War. We just don't realize, and a great number of those were civilian. Next was the French Indo-Chinese War. The French Union as I said earlier, had returned to the country after the end of the Second World War. The Viet Minh, who were led by Ho Chi Minh, after about a year of pussyfooting around, started a revolution. That war ended at Dien Bien Phu and partition of the country between North and South Vietnam. In that war, 1,500,000 died, and it ended at Dien Bien Phu. So what happens next is America wades in. Our war in Vietnam is officially labeled 1954 because that's when the French left through 1975, although we were gone by then. The first American advisors, the Military Assistance Advisory Group, were actually sent to Vietnam in 1950 by Harry Truman. Following the partition, our advisor level grew and grew and grew, and the North initiated a civil war with the South. After 9 years of increasing instability, Diem was overthrown, and a series of generals led the South for the rest of the war. American combat troops arrived in 1964. By 1969, there were 550,000 American troops in country, with no end in sight. We disengaged and were gone from Vietnam by 1973. Almost immediately, the North invaded the South and overran its defenders. 3 million people died in that conflict, and as we all know, about 60,000 of those were American. What followed in Southeast Asia was a war between Cambodia and Vietnam, primarily because Cambodia was so destabilized, they were causing trouble for Ho Chi Minh and his crew. So the North, what was then the Republic of Vietnam, invaded Cambodia. By the time they were through, another 2 million people were dead in the killing fields of Cambodia. What happens next is the Middle East becomes the focus. First, there was the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And it was interesting to read a little bit about this because I had heard things about it, but I didn't know that much. A group of insurgents, whose name in general was called the Mujahideen, with some Maoist groups, started a guerrilla war against the Soviet occupiers and the Republic of Afghanistan. The Mujahideen were backed by the United States. They were backed by Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, and the United Kingdom, all of whom were doing it under the table. Between 500,000 and 2 million civilians were killed in that Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. I did not realize how big the Soviet army was in Afghanistan. When they left, they had almost as many troops in Afghanistan as we had in Vietnam, somewhere in the vicinity of 600,000 Soviet troops were in Afghanistan. The next war, and I didn't know anything about this, was the Iran-Iraq War, 1980, 1988. And what happened in that war was Iraq invaded Iran. It lasted for 8 years. The UN, the United Nations, brokered a ceasefire. And if you want to know why they did it, their plan, they being Saddam Hussein, his plan was to cripple Iran to prevent Khomeini from exporting his revolutionary movement to Iraq. That was his reason for invading Iran. More than 1 million people were killed in this war, and more than one person has said we should have encouraged them to do each other in, looking at it in hindsight. The next one was the Gulf Wars, starting in 1990, and I put a question mark because if I'm not mistaken, in 2020, we are still in Iraq. It began with Operation Desert Shield in 1990-91, which was operations leading to the buildup of troops in defense of Saudi Arabia. Operation Desert Storm then followed. That was a war waged by coalition forces, and I did not remember this. There were 35 different nations involved in Operation Desert Storm. So Bush the First did a good job, along with Colin Powell, in getting this to be a concerted effort by a large number of allies. Why did we go into Iraq? It was a response to Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait. And why did they do that? It was about oil, pricing and production disputes. 300,000 people were killed in the Gulf Wars. Now, what are the recurring themes about all this? The illustrations that I just went over were only half of the wars, the major wars of the century. The list of ethnic revolutions during the century is into the hundreds. Just for fun, I looked up how many different revolutions occurred, and I quit counting after several hundred. There were revolutions all over Africa, all over South America, all over Asia. They just continued throughout the 20th century. More than 175 million people lost their lives as a result of these conflicts. This is a pretty significant feature, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in the conclusion. But what happened during this period of time, remember about control and order and who was establishing order? In 1900, colonial empires controlled the world. By 2000, if there is any control, it's being controlled by these empire states. US, Russia, and China and Germany are probably the 4 most salient ones, but those are now the 7 most influential countries left in the world. The United States, for the last, 50, 60 years, has taken upon itself the British responsibility for maintaining order all over the world. These wars were also consequences of economic volatility and ethnic conflict. But if you think about all of the things that I've gone through, it's very hard to come up with any kind of common denominator. It basically comes down to we can't get along together. Now, how has the 21st century fared? Terrorism is probably the most salient feature of the 21st century. 9/11 is just its illustration. But what 9/11 did was it prompted us to invade Afghanistan. We've been in Afghanistan now 20 years. I'm not even sure who the Taliban are with respect to the original group that was in Afghanistan when the Russians were there. But as Colin Powell is alleged to have said, don't invade somebody if you don't plan to fix it. And we haven't been able to fix it. Next was the invasion of Iraq. Same situation. We are still in Iraq. Everything about that I read about Iraq just makes me cringe. As soon as we turn our backs, trouble begins anew. Then there was the revolution in Syria, which you haven't heard much about, at least I haven't heard that much about lately, but apparently it's still going on. There has been throughout this entire 20th century instability in Africa. I did not list any of their wars, partially because I don't know that much about them and it's not that easy to find information about it. But Africa is most assuredly unstable right now. And then there's this little global warming and pandemic to concern ourselves with. So what are the conclusions that I draw from this extensive expostulation? The world order has changed drastically during the 20th century. It is still changing. And where it is going is anybody's guess. Now, this is all despite the fact that we live longer and are more productive than we've ever been before. We are still unable to find a new order in this world. I think the United States is backing away from taking any kind of proactive responsibility in maintaining that order. Not a single year in that whole century was there a year without large-scale organized violence. Even as the world grew 10 times economically, its growth rate of the previous 3 centuries. So it was a century of incredible technical development, incredible financial, economic growth, and yet it was full of fighting. Today, the empire states are competing for dominance, both economically and militarily. We are in a very, very uncertain time, and I guess it's unclear about where we go from here. Which brings me to an end. Any questions?
No questions, George.
Are we any more uncertain today than they were in 1900?
Oh, yeah. 1900, they were fat, dumb, and happy. Everything was fine.
Okay, 1918.
I wasn't around in 1918. I think that in 1918, revenge was on the minds of the winners. And revenge pretty quickly got on the minds of the losers. So they did not do a very good job of cleaning up the mess of the First World War.
I don't know. My only point is I don't think we've ever been stable. There's always been one side or the other side's trying to get the upper hand.
I think you're right. I think since 1900, there has never been, and I'm not even sure how stable things were in 1900. It very much depends on where you're looking at something from. If you're looking at it from, say, Great Britain's point of view, you were in fat, dumb, and happy. If you were looking at it from the point of view of people who were being dominated, you might not have been one bit happy.
George, I was always, when I first heard the New World Order, I believe it came from George W. Herbert Walker Bush. When he started talking about this New World Order, I was very confused. What was that going to be like? Evidently, we're still trying to find or define what a New World Order looks like. But in conclusion, it's man's inhumanity to man that's always been around, and it probably always will be. It's sad, but so true. When you talk about the conflicts, almost every year during the 20th century, there was a conflict.
In 2001, I guess, there was a belief in the W. White House. Time democracy a viable factor, at least in the Middle East. We were going to spread democracy. That was going to be the world order. Obviously, it didn't take.
Did you ever total up all your numbers of how many people got killed?
175 million.
Oh, that was your total number? Okay.
Yep.
And probably more civilians were killed than military.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. More than 2/3 of them were civilians.
It was amazing.
George,
Absolutely.
wouldn't it make sense, though, that a lot of those deaths, particularly in the first part of the 20th century, were nutrition, starvation, lack of housing, that sort of thing for the civilians?
Disease, all of the above. Absolutely. They weren't all dying from bombing and what do you call it? Not extraneous fire, but
Collateral damage.
unintended consequences. Very much of it was starvation. Disease was part of it.
Well, the pandemic back in 1918 killed 50 million people.
Yes, it did.
I mean, that's a heck of a number.
Okay.
George, the other thing that comes to my mind is that you remember Colin Powell, back when he was chief of staff and then secretary of state, you know, he coined the term, "We can't be the world policeman." I remember at the time, I liked the idea. I don't see how we can avoid that, though.
Well, that's what some people think brought about 9/11. We were backing away from Al-Qaeda in the latter part of the 20th century. We knew about Al-Qaeda, and we decided that we had an ocean between us and them. And we found out that didn't work.
Well, the unfortunate thing is you cannot appease terrorism.